Rural China is paying the cost of the country's rapid economic gains. Separation of families, disappearing villages, and left behind children and seniors. Will families ever return to their home soil? Can a village look after its elderly residents? How can our country protect its children from abuse and neglect? Several girls have fallen victims of rape. From north to south, join Feng Xin in search of rural recovery on CCTV News.
Today is our last installment of the Rural Recovery series, and we end on a heavy note: child sexual abuse in the countryside. We lack official data to demonstrate the magnitude of such crimes, but compiled media reports from 2015 show that more than 70% of the victims were between 7 and 14 years old. The lack of care and surveillance makes children especially vulnerable. Our reporter Feng Xin traveled to a village in Tieling in Liaoning province, where several young girls have fallen victim to one particular predator over a long period. Well, Feng Xin hears the voices of the families of the victims and looks at what can be done to better guard rural children. Well, the names of the victims and their families have been changed.
The days have been dark for Mr. and Mrs. Li as they consider the court's verdict after 9 months of prosecution. The predator who molested their 12-year-old daughter Lily and raped 3 other girls has been sentenced to 17.5 years in prison. But the Li family believes that the sentence was too lenient.
I'm absolutely discontented with the ruling. How can he just get away after causing so much harm to our children here?
My daughter said, "Mom, I don't want to go to school anymore." I don't. Her father cried, and I cried. The 3 of us just held each other and cried together.
The Lis survive on a small section of land by growing corn. They leave their house to farm in the very early morning each day, and their daughter often has to stay at home alone during the weekends and school holidays. It wasn't until July 2015 that Mr. Li found Lily with a new cell phone. She told him that it was a 60-year-old man who lived across the street gave it to her.
He texted obscene language and pornography to our daughter. I was just shocked.
To Mr. Li's surprise, those texts also mentioned the names of several other girls in the village. Mr. Li called the police, who arrested the man and found 2 other cell phones in his possession. It turned out that the offender often shot nude images of the young girls and filmed himself raping them. Mrs. Liang still can't accept the fact that her granddaughter Wei Wei was only 9 years old when she was first raped, and that the offender is a family relative. The rapes occurred more than a dozen times over the past 3 years. Most of the crimes took place in their very own house while the adults are away. Wei Wei's parents were seeking a living in the city, so it was Mrs. Liang who raised Wei Wei.
I asked my granddaughter, "How could you not tell me anything?" She said, "If I told you, he would kill me. You would also beat me and kill me." The man threatened and terrified her.
Prosecutors brought 3 rape and 2 molestation charges against the defendant in March, but the court did not support one of the molestation charges. That's because there was only a child's words against the defendant, and there wasn't any physical evidence to prove anything that happened 7 years ago.
She still remembered the clothes she was wearing on that day when we went to a police interview last year. She grabbed me really tight and buried her face in my arms. She cried and was extremely terrified, as if she was in huge shame. Every child is a part of a mother's heart. No mother can accept such abuse of their child.
After multiple attempts to reach the prosecutor's office and court, no judicial officials made themselves available for comment. This village is 40 kilometers away from the nearest city. Few can imagine several girls have fallen victims of rape and molestation for so many times and for so long. Across China, the media reported about 340 child sexual abuse cases in 2015, almost one incident every day. Experts say this is just a tip of an iceberg because many more cases stay silent. Out of the reported cases, about 1/3 took place in rural areas, far less than cities. Experts say this doesn't mean child sexual abuse in countryside is any less severe than in cities, but because they are more difficult to be discovered and reported.
我刚上车，我看这小伙子，挺漂亮的，挺帅气的，是啊。
Beijing lawyer Xiao Juan volunteers to teach children about sexual abuse prevention. She has found that nearly 70% of such crimes were committed by acquaintances. Prosecutions and convictions often prove difficult to achieve.
难点最大的难点就是举证问题，是由于各种原因的瞒案不报。
The biggest difficulty is collecting evidence. Because of various reasons, many cases went unreported. This not only led to additional crimes, but also a loss of evidence and ineffective prosecutions and investigations.
然后在实务上，难以成案。
Volunteers and NGOs have been seeking measures to prevent child sexual abuse in urban and rural areas. One way is to teach children to protect their private body parts, recognizing danger and seeking help.
We hope to make more children, in fact, all children in China, receive our classes. Also, I think the country should increase penalties for predators. If the cost of crime is high, perhaps people are less likely to commit.
But for the children who never had a chance to learn about the dangers around them, the wounds can never be healed. Feng Xin, CCTV, in Tieling, Liaoning province.
And for more about the child abuse story, let's turn to our reporter Feng Xin here in the studio. Good evening, Feng Xin. This is a very sad and horrifying story. But we lack official data on the scale and scope of such offense and abuse. Is this a problem in the countryside? Do we have any number to suggest?
Well, Zhou Yue, a non-profit organization called Girls Protection Fund has been following this very closely for the last 3 years. And between 2013 and 2015, Chinese media reported 968 cases, and 2015 alone accounted for 340. And in these reported cases, nearly 90% of victims were under the age of 14, and those between 7 and 14 years old were most vulnerable. 70% of such crimes were committed by acquaintances, and they include teachers, neighbors, family members, relatives, and friends of families. And in terms of crime locations, these cases took place most often in victims' own house, followed by school and the assailant's home, and sometimes occasionally outdoors and in hotels. So you can see a rough pattern here.
In your story, the volunteer organizer says that apart from providing education on safety, more important is probably at the legislative level. What can we learn from other countries in this area?
Well, Zhou Yue, I'd say the most significant law is the Jessica's Law in Florida, the United States. The law was named after a 10-year-old girl, Jessica Lunsford, who was raped and murdered in 2005 by a previously convicted sex offender. The law requires a minimum sentence of 25 years in prison for sexual abuse of a child under 12. Sex offenders will have to wear electronic monitoring devices following their release,
or for life if they are deemed pedophiles. And in South Korea, rape of a girl under 13 is sentenced to 10 years to life in prison, and repeated child sex offenders will be given chemical castration. And in China, rape of a girl under the age of 14 is sentenced to 10 years to life in prison, and death penalty will be given if the offender rapes a number of girls or causes serious injury or death. And experts say although China has toughened the laws against child sex crimes in recent years, there are still weaknesses. First, the laws do not cover boys, so sex crimes against boys are hardly penalized. And secondly, China lacks supporting measures such as community watch, specialized legal and medical support, and psychological counseling to curtail and prevent child sex crimes. So China still has a long way to go. And for more statistics about China's child sex abuse cases, how different countries punish such crimes, and a handbook on how to help children protect themselves, you can scan the code at the bottom of your screen with your smartphone.
And also, I care very much about what happened to the girl and her family, and what happened to the offender. Has he been brought to justice?
Well, the offender is already in prison and serving his 17 years and a half in prison. Well, at the time of my interview, the 5 families had already passed the deadline for appeal because they didn't know what to do and didn't have any legal support. And 3 families had already transferred their children to new schools where nobody knows them. And the other 2 children, including Lily, are still staying at their village school. But the parents told me that their daughters had become very depressed. These children no longer like to talk to people or hang out with their friends. And as for me, I've been feeling powerless throughout my reporting because there's nothing more I can do to help the afflicted. Right at this moment, I know the families are watching this live broadcast, even though they don't speak English. We as journalists generally write a story and we move on, but those we write about are forever changed. That's for me, Zoe.
Actually, you've helped them by bringing the story on air. Thank you very much for your reporting.